Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this workshop, How to Protect Your Assets and Loved Ones. Thank you so much for joining me. Just waiting for people to join and get settled in. Just whilst they're doing that, let me know in the chat whereabouts you are today, whereabouts you're watching this in the UK. I'd love to know, pop that in the chat for me. And just whilst we are waiting for people to join and settle in, I'll just give a very brief introduction about this workshop, and I'll be talking about how we can achieve financial security by protecting your money and income for your loved ones, and how we go about this through legal help and advice to prepare for when we pass away, and ill health by making a will and lasting power of attorney, but also how we can overcome the things that get in our way and stop us from doing this. And I'll be talking a lot more about this as we go through the workshop. Things like time and reluctance to talk about illness and dying. I'll be sharing stories from my 16 years of experience of helping lots of clients, thousands of clients with this, and I'll share my own personal relationship with wills and the subject of illness and death, and how my experiences have helped me through the ups and downs of life. And the reason for running these workshops is because I see the struggles that people have when it comes to making wills and lasting powers of attorney. And that might be because people don't know how to go about it, not appreciating the importance of doing it, and the consequences when they don't have them in place. What I really wanted to do was find a way to break all this down and make it easy for people to put these protections in place with wills and powers of attorney. Thank you for those who have let me know where you are. So hello to Claire in Flintshire from Homestart. Lovely to have you joining us, Claire, and Janice in Marlow and Ian in Bracknell. So thank you for that. So I'm in Kent, which is quite nice today. So we're having quite a good week so far weather-wise. So now that most of you have joined and hopefully we've all settled in, we have about an hour together this evening. And that leads me to my first question. Do you have conversations about dying and illness at the moment? Just a question to ponder. If anyone would like to share any thoughts, I'd love you to do so in the chat again. It'd be interesting to hear from you, and whether anybody at the moment, whether you do have conversations about dying and illness. I will come back to this later and talk a bit about, how perhaps we don't always have these conversations and how that links to wills and powers of attorney. My aim for this session and this workshop, my plan is to give you as much information as possible as I can in the time we have together. Ask any questions. There will be some time at the end. No question is off limit, so anything you like to ask. Towards the end, I'll also be sharing how you can work with me if this is something of interest. And I'll take you through my How to Protect Your Assets and Loved Ones process. And as I say, I will be giving as much guidance, information as possible as I can this evening. So thank you, Claire. Claire's said only in recent years as parents got old and experienced illness. I think that's a really good point, Claire, because I think for a lot of people that does happen when our parents do start reaching later life. It does tend to bring up that the whole question of illness, dying, and actually what we need to do about that. So thank you for that, and yeah, same for Janet. So thank you for those comments. The information I'm going to be sharing with you this evening has come from so many clients and people that I've helped, I've spoke to over the last 16 years about. That's how long I've been doing this, and assisting clients with making wills, powers of attorney, but also helping families with relatives with dementia. It might be about care funding advice, court of protection, but particularly with wills and lasting powers of attorney. And what I found that's happened over the last two and a half years since I became a self-employed solicitor, I'm a self-employed consultant solicitor, really allowed me to understand my clients' challenges and needs. And what I have seen is the common reasons why people fail to make a will and to make lasting powers of attorney. If you look at the statistics, we still have a large proportion of the population who don't have these in place. They don't make wills, they don't make powers of attorney, and powers of attorney even more so with wills. And these were the reasons I'm going to share now, the 5 common reasons why people don't put these protections into place. So they don't make wills, they don't make powers of attorney. The first one is the belief that we have plenty of time to make our wills, make our powers of attorney, and it's not prioritized. And I think, unfortunately, none of us really know what's going to happen in the future and at what point we may get ill, and ultimately at what point we will pass away. It is something we all have in common. It will happen to all of us, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later on. And then linked with that is people will start to make a will, they may start to make their powers of attorney, but they don't finish them. And unfortunately, if we don't complete them, we don't have legally binding documents. So, for example, some clients will say to me, well, we've had a meeting and we've perhaps discussed what we would like to include in a will. We have something in writing, but unless we've actually got to the point of finishing the will and it's legally witnessed, signed, then it's not legally binding, so it can't be relied upon. The third reason is not discussing with anyone what they would like to happen when they pass away or become ill. And it's that fear of discussing death which gets in the way. As I say, we'll talk a lot more about that later. The fourth is not appreciating how important wills and powers of attorney is. And then linked to that is thinking that this is simple, a will is just a document, it needs to be written, and the same with powers of attorney, and they don't get help and they attempt to do it themselves. What I'd love to know from everybody on the call this evening, there's a few of us who are joining this workshop. Do any of those relate to you specifically, or do you have any experience of that? We've had some comments about having these discussions with parents, but I'd just love to know if any of those reasons resonate with you, and if any of them perhaps relate to you now. Do you see these as a reason why perhaps we don't make wills, we don't make powers of attorney? Perhaps none of them do, but I also love to know that as well. It's really interesting to see from the research and the discussions that you have with people and clients about this, and it's great to be able to get people's views on that. So if anyone would like to share, put the number of the one that most relates to you. This is how I've structured this evening's session. And I'll just explain briefly each section. So part one is going to be about protection. So how we get started, where exactly do we start? And this is the part we really need to focus on. So how do we get going with making wills and powers of attorney? Part two is support, which is how do we get it right for our own individual circumstances, and make sure we get the correct advice. And then part three, decisions. How do we get it all done and make sure that we actually have the protections in place and we do finish them? A few comments come in regarding those reasons why people don't make their wills and powers of attorney. So number two, people resonate with, so they start but don't finish them. Yes, that's such a good point. Putting it off, yes, absolutely. I think that's such a key point. Is it? And unfortunately, it is easy to put off. I think, you know, I've certainly experienced this, and again, I'll share my experiences later. And then, again, Claire, thank you for your comments. Family member passed away 3 weeks ago, but not discussed wishes with all family members, only some, and did not write a will. Yes, that can unfortunately happen. It can get to a point perhaps where it is too late, and there are perhaps other things going on as well, which may mean that, you know, a will is perhaps unfortunately seen as the last priority. And then that's again, there's another good point actually there in the chat. They think they don't need them yet. Yes, absolutely. I've yeah, such a great point. How many times do you see clients? I've certainly seen clients, and they say they don't have anything to leave or they're not at the right age. But as I was saying earlier, none of us really know what's going to happen in the future and when our time will unfortunately come to an end. Thank you for that, everyone. They're really, really good points there. Okay. A very brief section about me. For those who don't know me, I'm a consultant solicitor at Richard Nelson Solicitors. I'm also a visiting lecturer for the University of Law and a private client law trainer. I am on a bit of a mission, in all honesty, to educate about the importance of wills and powers of attorney and to try and help people, and as many people, but get them in place as I can. And whether I do that through these workshops or the other work I do through my social media content or working with clients. Which brings me to the point about LinkedIn. I was just going to mention, if we are not already connected on LinkedIn, I'd love to connect with you. So there's a QR code there you can use. Point your camera at the screen, it'll take you through to my profile and we can connect. So I say, if we are not connected already, then I would love to connect with you. Before I move on to the in-depth content, I wanted to address why we should be focusing on wills and powers of attorney. Why now? And I think that's quite important, because why at this difficult time? You know, we are experiencing lots of challenges at the moment. So why at this particular time and this particular point should we be focusing on this? And to be honest, there are so many reasons why it's important to have a will and lasting power of attorney. And I think the three main ones which often come up is it enables us to protect our loved ones, to protect our property and money, our assets, but also to protect our business if we have one, and our income and finances. It's a good point here just to pause and make a distinction between wills and powers of attorney. Some of you may be aware of this already. So a will is setting out what we would like to happen when we pass away and making sure our wishes are known. Powers of attorney are setting out what we would like to happen if we become ill. So powers of attorney are about what's going to happen to us during our lifetime. So if we're unable to make our own decisions, and perhaps we lose mental capacity and the ability to make our own decisions, manage our finances, for example, then we have somebody in place to do that for us. And the two go hand in hand, and powers of attorney are an extension to will making because they are very much interlinked. And I often say that when people make a will, it's often not about when we pass away and when we die. There's usually a reason, and again, I'll talk about this later on in the workshop. There's a reason why somebody is motivated to make a will, which is something that's usually something that's happening in their life at the moment. And as I've mentioned, there are so many reasons why it is important, and some of the other reasons may be we could die without any protections in place. We want to make sure that our money, our property, and our assets go to who we want them to go to, and not to somebody we don't. If we own a business, for example, it could come grinding to a halt. That could mean a loss of income, a loss of business. If we become ill, we want to be able to make decisions, and somebody may need to make those decisions for us. And that could be the simple decisions about keeping our house running, paying our bills, but also the more, I was going to say more important decisions about health and care, but I think keeping the house running is just as important. But also to give security to those we leave behind. And also, who's going to look after the pets? And for the animal lovers out there, actually, let me know in the chat if you have a pet. I'd love to know. But for the animal lovers out there, the pets are so important. And making a will, making our powers of attorney, make sure that we can put our contingency plans in place, who's going to look after the pets. And actually, one of the reasons why I started to update my will regularly was because of pets. And I lost our cat actually not recently, it was about a year ago now. Still feels very recent. So it's a good way of just making sure we cater for everything that we have in our lives. So yeah, Claire to mention she has 2 dogs. Fantastic. We've got hands full there. But yeah, such joy they bring us. But this is what can happen if we don't have a will. You can see from the slide, this is really difficult to look at, but it just illustrates the point really well, that it is complex when we don't have a will. I'm going to navigate away from that slide quite quickly because it is difficult to view. How do we get started with all this then? And what do we need to put all of this into place? And this is the area that the majority don't do. Again, this is what I've noticed when speaking with people, when working with clients. This is the area that the majority are missing. And most people won't take these steps. Planning is the first step. Important conversations, so having those conversations about illness and dying, and then making a decision so we can actually get started and get to the end point. And this is what I notice happening all the time. And most think, and I mentioned this earlier, that wills, powers of attorney, they're simple, they're easy to do, they're just this document, but it really needs context. And I realised, even more so when I became a self-employed solicitor, and bear in mind I've been doing this for a long, long time, I did have this big realisation that wills and powers of attorney, they are more than just this legal document. And then realising what we needed to make them work for us, and for me, ultimately, the clients I help. And we do need to give it that context. So thinking about what do we have, what assets do we have, what money do we have, what liabilities do we have, and then connected with that is our family tree. So take the time to draw up the family tree. And then we need to make our wishes known, and it needs to be in a tangible form. And this comes from doing extra work, if you like, with the will and the powers of attorney. What I would call a letter of wishes. So it's an extension to the actual will document, powers of attorney document. But what it's doing, it's thinking about what your loved ones and what your business partners need to know if you have a business, and recording that in writing, as well as talking about it. And this was important to John Paul and Ben. Now, I mentioned at the start, I'm going to be sharing stories and examples of clients I've helped. The clients I mentioned are not real names for reasons of confidentiality. So they are just examples of lots of people I've helped over the years, and some of the similar situations they find themselves in. But they are real stories from the clients I've helped. But as I say, not any real names here. So John Paul and Ben, they had started to make wills, lasting powers of attorney, but they did get stuck. And part of it, they did have multiple conflicting concerns. There was a lot going on for them, to be honest. They also needed a certificate provider for their lasting powers of attorney. The certificate provider is the legal aspect. Just to perhaps explain that, it's somebody who will confirm that the person who is making the power of attorney, they are able to understand it and they have mental capacity to make the power of attorney. And it was a worry for John Paul and Ben because the home that they lived in together and their family home was just in John Paul's name. They had various personal effects. They had business interests actually in later life. This was part of their retirement planning. They wanted to record what they would like in the event they became ill, and also how they wished to be cared for in later life. And because of the house situation, because it was just in John Paul's name, they were concerned about equity release. So if they wanted to release some capital from the property, what would that mean for Ben? There were a lot going on. And what we did together is we recorded who would manage the business interests, how the personal effects would be dealt with, making sure they go to the correct people. We set out what they would both want if they became ill or needed care. And we were doing this within the letter of wishes. So we had our wills, we had our powers of attorney, but we had that extra value, which was giving the meat to the bones of the actual will and power of attorney. I then acted as certificate provider for the powers of attorney, so they didn't have the stress of finding someone to do it, explaining what they needed to do. And once this was done, they knew that their assets were secure, they had peace of mind, Ben wouldn't be left without a home, which was a really important point for John Paul and Ben. The second area that the majority don't do is have those important conversations. We touched upon this already. And in all honesty, most of us don't want to talk about dying. It is a bit of a taboo subject. I think that's very much so in the UK. It's interesting when you look at how other cultures deal with grief and dying. And I was listening to a podcast not that long ago. I do tell this story quite often. It was a little time ago, but it was talking about the fact that in certain cultures they will have a period of grief, but it was all out grief, for the want of a better word. They were going through this process and actually really grieving. And the idea was that after, when that period of time has elapsed, it would then allow them to continue with the life, having spent the time, but also allowing themselves to grieve, because that's another thing that perhaps happens, is we don't give ourselves the time to stop and, as I say, allow us to grieve, rather than we will perhaps get on with life and do what we need to do the practical things. And of course, everybody deals with grief in a very different way. But sometimes we don't have the tools. If we're not talking about this, we don't then have the tools to deal with it when it happens to somebody close to us. And yet it's something we all have in common. It's guaranteed. We will all die. That's the one of the few common things that every human being on this planet has in common. But it's not having these conversations that's then preventing us from making our wills and powers of attorney. And this is what happened to me. It's fair to say I have made quite a few wills during my time, considering what I do for a living, but it took me some time to get to the point of firstly doing my first will. But then as I started to reflect on the work I was doing, and in all honesty, this was more so when I started self-employment in 2022, I really began to consider, well, what's going to happen when we pass away? How do my clients deal with that? What can I do to help them and support them through that? And then, of course, we had 2020 and what happened in the next years, and that really made me connect with the thought that, yes, one day I will pass away. It helped me to engage with death and actually really think about what was important to me, what I wanted to do in life, gave me the courage to do it, which was ultimately moving into self-employment. But not only that, it does connect us with our loved ones. So we're then not worrying what's going to happen to them when we've gone. And there's just a few examples here, pictures on the slides of what I've been doing over the last few years and all the great opportunities that self-employment has given. Yes, of course, it's really challenging, but this came about because I was having those conversations and addressing ill health and dying. And I mentioned there on the slides that it's an interesting subject to talk about. If you do talk about death, bring it to the dinner table, it goes into all sorts of different subjects, topics, conversations. Try it if you haven't done so already. Give it a go. So when I reflected on all of this, I realized that we need to slow down and reflect on what we really want. And that means giving us the permission to think about illness and death, and have those conversations with those closest to us. If we're not comfortable doing that with those closest to us, then think about somebody else, whether that's a professional, a solicitor, that can open up and start us on our way. And we must talk openly about death. And ultimately, we're protecting those that we leave behind so that we're not having any regrets. And when we get those two things right, so the planning and the important conversations, it's much easier to get our wills done, make our lasting powers of attorney. Begins to come together. You and your loved ones, you know what to do because you've talked about it. You know how to get started with planning, putting the protections in place, what you will need and how to approach it. And this is what I helped Sandra with. Another story I'd like to share from the clients I've helped. And Sandra needed to update her will and make lasting powers of attorney. She wanted to downsize and move house, and she was really concerned about burdening her two friends, who she'd chosen to be attorneys and her executors. So executors under the will, who deal with the will, the wishes in your will and your estate when you pass away. So dealing with all of your assets and working out what you have and what liabilities, expenses you need to pay, and everything that comes with dealing with probate. And it was because she didn't have any close family or family that she was particularly close to be able to take on that role. So there was a real concern about burdening her two friends. And what we did together is we actually had the conversations with all three of them. And the friends needed guidance more than anything. And we was able to do that. And we discussed and recorded what Sandra wanted. This helped her friends to understand what they would need to do, exactly what Sandra's wishes were. And we worked out a plan. And Sandra felt that her friends were no longer burdened. And I think sometimes this happens when we are making wills and powers of attorney. We exclude our chosen attorneys, our executors. And even we ourselves, when we're doing them, we don't always understand what exactly we have in place. If you'd like a chance to speak with me about creating your plan for this, I'm going to leave a link here to book a short session in with me. And I mentioned at the beginning, I'd share if it was of interest, if you'd like to work with me or have an initial session just to talk about creating your own plan, who to have conversations with, get some clarity. So there's a link there where you can book in a call with me. So again, if you use the camera, it'll take you through to my calendar and you can book in a call. And I'll leave that QR code on the slide, so it will appear on all the slides until the end of this workshop. My top tips for protection then, I'll bring these up on the slides. I won't go through all of them with you. My top tip for this section is engage with death, have those conversations, but also think about this process of making wills and powers of attorney as more than a legal document. Give it that context it needs. Has part one been useful? Let me know in the chat if it has. I'd appreciate that. It's an important starting point to make sure that you get the correct advice for you and the wills and lasting powers of attorney. They do what you need them to do. And this is what part two is going to be all about. So part two is support. And it's focusing in on what you need to do to get them tailored for you and then put everything in place. And then, unfortunately, this is now the majority of people I speak to, clients I've helped, they get wrong and they almost take these ineffective actions when it comes to this part of the process of making wills and powers of attorney. And there are two things we need to do. One is to implement. So that's the first thing we need to do when it comes to support, getting help, getting the right advice. And the second is communication and action. There's two elements to implementing. One is deep dive, and the second is getting help. So the first, I wanted to talk about what do we mean by deep dive? It's an extension of planning, but it's also why. It's thinking about, why am I making the will and that's the power of attorney? And I mentioned earlier that a lot of the time I've noticed that when clients are making wills, powers of attorney, there is always a reason which underpins that, and it's something that's going on in their life. And ironically, it's not always about dying. Why is quite interesting. Some of you may be familiar with particularly the work of Simon Sinek, who talks a lot about why and purpose. And so do lots of people out there. In fact, I would recommend Simon's book, Start With Why. But the same applies here. It's really interesting. And it might be because we want to protect our partner, our children, our business. But it also might be to save tax. It might be that we want to exclude somebody from our will because we're having a difficult relationship with them. It might be divorce. It might be that we've recently married or entered into a civil partnership. It could be a new relationship. So there's always these reasons which underpin why people are making their wills and making their powers of attorney. I've just put a few examples there on the slides of clients who have, mentioned this point and about getting the specific advice and trying to work out what their why is. And I'll just give some other examples of why people will make wills and powers of attorney. Protecting money from care costs can be quite an important consideration for people. It might be that we mentioned this earlier, somebody that you know has passed away, making sure the assets go to the correct people. We might want to organise our finances. So it's a great way of doing that when you're making your will and power of attorney, because we always need to think about our assets and our liabilities. We might worry about what will happen if we become ill, security and peace of mind, and then lack of control. And if you remember from earlier, this diagram that links with this lack of control, well, this is what's going to happen if we don't have a will. So it's taken out of our hands to a certain extent. The second aspect of this implementation is getting help. And most think, unfortunately, that they can do it themselves, and they perhaps take a substandard option when it comes to making wills in particular. They may speak with friends and family who've done it before. They may ask Google. And this results in the wrong advice. And the reason is because it's generic. So there are so many different ways we can make wills nowadays and make powers of attorney. We have the DIY approach. We have the different services that we offer. They're not all the same. And, particularly with the DIY approach, it misses the opportunity to get that tailored and specific advice for our own circumstances. And that's what is needed. It needs to be tailored, and arguably the most important legal service we will ever use, making a will, making power of attorney. And that's because we're protecting our loved ones, we're protecting our assets, our money, our property, we're protecting our income, our business if we have one, or our finances. And legal advice is needed. We need to make sure that the wills are correct, powers of attorney are correct, they are legally binding. As we've seen with John Paul and Ben, as we've seen with Sandra, we want to make sure that they do what we need them to do. And without that extra advice, that extra work, they are just a document. And I'd like to share Tim's story, which is an example when it does go all wrong. Now, Tim went down the DIY route with a homemade will. And unfortunately, the correct formalities were not used when the will was signed and witnessed. Now, that meant the will was not legally binding. So we have certain rules when it comes to signing and witnessing a will. And if you do take the DIY approach, in all honesty, this is probably the most common reason why wills are then invalid. And the reason why this was so key to Tim was because he wanted to leave his house to a friend. He had distant relatives, not immediate blood relatives, but he had cousins, I believe, and they would have inherited via the rules of intestacy. So that diagram I showed earlier, the really complicated diagram, that's what happens when you don't have a will, known as the rules of intestacy. And because the will was invalid, his whole estate, including the house and the money, went to his relatives rather than the house going to his friend as he wished. And that was because the formalities were not followed. The will was invalid. And this is also what happened to Mike and his father. They decided to make lasting powers of attorney themselves. So Mike's father really wanted to get this in place. They decided to do it because Mike's father's dementia was worsening. They needed to be able to help. So Mike needed to be able to help his father make decisions about finances and care, access bank accounts, for example. And unfortunately, Mike's father's mental capacity was in doubt. So his dementia was unfortunately having an effect on his ability to make decisions and on his mental capacity. And if he lacked mental capacity under the law, he would not be able to make a power of attorney. And I was able to help arrange a mental capacity assessment. So when Mike and his father came to see me, I was able to arrange this assessment, support them to make the powers of attorney, make sure that Mike's father had mental capacity, which we did through having a proper assessment, and that ultimately meant the powers of attorney could be completed. Mike could then help his father manage his finances, pay his bills, access his bank accounts, and help with decision making, make his father comfortable. So that's implementation. And I mentioned at the start of this section the two things we need to do here. So we have implementation and the different aspects of that. And then we have communication and action. Touched upon this briefly already. So instead of speaking to people who've done this already, asking Google, I certainly do that way too often for lots of different things and trying to find lots of information. The problem is it's generic advice, it's not tailored to us. And in the context of wills and powers of attorney, it is unfortunately a waste of time. It is a waste of time. So instead, spend the time writing out a list of questions that are important to you. So again, go back to why, think about the why, but also think about what do I need to know? What do I need, which is going to help me to make my will and to make my power of attorney? And this is what I helped Jill with. I sent Jill a checklist of specific points to consider. And this actually helped me to draw out the key information and tailor the advice to Jill's situation. And it helped me discover her priorities. And with Jill, there were lots of competing priorities for Jill. There was a business involved. Jill had a partner. They were all married. Jill had other family members she wanted to benefit. So there needed to be an element of a a trust in the will, because Jill did want to make sure that at least part of her estate went to her side of the family, and also to benefit her other family members. And her partner, of course, was equally important. They were due to marry. So it's important that she got the advice, well, what's going to happen to my will if I get married or enter into a civil partnership? And if we do already have a will in place and we later marry or we enter into a civil partnership, then our will is actually invalidated unless we've said in the will otherwise. So unless we've included wording in a will which specifically states that the will is not to be invalidated, not to be revoked upon marriage or civil partnership. There's another good example of where the wording is really important in the will. And those are the types of things that we can miss when we are perhaps taking the DIY route. My top tips for support then, talked about this a lot. Think about your why. Love that concept. Remember, it needs to be tailored to you. And I've mentioned there on the slides actually that ultimately a DIY approach could cost us more in the long run. And just keep in mind the importance of what we're doing. Going back to what I was saying earlier, arguably the most important legal service we will ever need. Once we have done all of that, we can then look at making decisions, pulling it all together and putting it into action. So making sure we have legally valid wills and powers of attorney. And the truth is, most take a shortcut. They think they can do it themselves. They don't take the legal advice. They think it's simple, doesn't get the attention it deserves. And sometimes, I think I mentioned this earlier, they don't always know exactly what they have in place. Their relatives don't always know because it's not been talked about, it's not been discussed. But there is a better way. And it's best if I, again, illustrate this with an example of clients I've helped. And in fact, with all clients I help, this is the process I will take them through and how I help and support clients with wills and powers of attorney. So Steve and Sue, lots going on for Steve and Sue, as is often the case. You know, as I've mentioned, everybody will have different circumstances, but there is always, everybody will have lots of different things going on. We may think otherwise, but it's just drawing out the key information. And I put there the background to Steve and Sue's situation. So again, unmarried, had children from previous relationships, were a business owner and a professional. They did have extended families, joint and sole assets, pets, but also social media accounts. And that was really important to them because they had a lot of memories, a lot of photos, information on social media. So what do we do about those? Again, another really important aspect to will making and making powers of attorney. And this is what we did together. So bringing together all of the information we went through, the planning stage, the one-to-one support, we could uncover the why was making a will and powers of attorney important for Steve and Sue. We could work out whether any inheritance tax was payable, what assets could be part of the will, whether we needed to change that. So looking at who owned what, looking at the actual structure of the will, how can we do this so it best protects the assets, but also give you the access and make sure that both Steve and Sue are protected, as well as the children and their family members. We looked at the business, or what's going to happen if something happens to you. How can we ensure the business can continue to run? And we also looked at the family tree, and I talked about this earlier, the importance of the family tree. It enables us to get a full picture of who your loved ones are, but also who are the important ones. So identify who's going to be included in the will, who gets what, perhaps prioritize particular family members, what protections are needed in place for children, and then consider any legal implications. And we did a similar thing with the powers of attorney. So business planning was really important, working out who the attorneys were going to be, making sure we weren't burdening the people, making sure they understand what was expected of them, help and support them through that decision-making process, plan out medical decisions, what they would like to happen if they became ill, make sure our finances were in order, they could be accessed if needed. And then we talked about the digital assets. So not only social media, but what else do we have digitally that we need to protect? And we talked about that. I have a guide, an ultimate guide to protecting your digital memories, which goes into this. But could sometimes get overlooked when we're making wills and powers of attorney. And all this work enabled us to draw the wills up and the powers of attorney. They were tailored specifically for Steve and Sue. They had the correct legal advice. They knew that their assets and family were secure. They didn't have to worry. The correct documents were in place. Wishes were known. Tax, hopefully, minimized and saved. And then making sure that the assets went to the correct people. And I won't go through all these in any detail. You can see it on the slide there. Peace of mind, it sometimes feels a bit, I was going to say obvious, but what I've found when helping clients is that this often comes up, this peace of mind, but it's not always at the forefront. But it's just, you know, once it's done, then we know, okay, I've done what I needed to do. I've done the best I can to protect those that I do leave behind, which then means we have less stress and we are more open to talking about illness, talking about dying. And then Steve and Sue also had a free 30-minute review within 2 years of drawing up the wills. I talk a lot about making sure our wills are updated, which they will need checking. Doesn't mean they need to be changed, but it's really useful to do that. And I usually recommend every 2 years, even if it's just a quick check. Okay, nothing's changed, may not need to do anything, but a really useful exercise to go through. My top tips for decisions, and again, I'll show those on the slides for you and just give you a moment